Well, good morning. Thank you for coming out. We have an announcement about what we think should happen here as we move to the end. If you haven't noticed, everybody's not wearing a mask. You can go to the Twins game and most people don't wear a mask. The hospitals don't have hardly anybody in them that are in there because of COVID. You cannot say that the emergency is not over. It's over. And so we've been working with the governor trying to figure out how do we end emergency powers. I will tell you that I just went to a conference myself and Minority Leader Dowd and some Democrat leaders that basically talked about emergency powers, and only 5 states have given up all emergency powers, but the vast number of them have restricted dramatically or limited the emergency powers. And what I will tell you is this year alone across the country, over 300 bills have been submitted nationwide to eliminate or reduce the emergency powers. So as we're moving forward, the governor has said, look, you're not giving me any way out of emergency powers. And so we have a bill that we presented to him. It's the Alaska model. We'll have that presented by the representative and the senator that are carrying that bill. But there clearly is a path out of it. The governor said he didn't want to lose any of the federal money coming in. This is a solution. We did present it to him, but he says it's not enough. And so we're wondering why it's not enough. One of the things that he has brought up is eviction moratorium. If you recall, months ago, the Senate passed a bipartisan bill that was an off-ramp to end eviction moratoriums. And why is the governor not calling the House Democrats to get that passed? It passed in the Senate with a veto-proof majority. We had so many votes that from Democrat and Republican and Independent that it would pass. So I need the governor to do his part. He has said that it's the legislative branch. Well, if you go back a couple years ago, he called Democrat senators to vote no on a bonding bill. Well, it's time that he votes, or he makes calls to the House Democrats and said, start voting yes on some of these things. Vote yes, for example, on ending the eviction moratorium. Vote yes for funding for the police and other things that we've tried to get done. So the governor needs to engage. He can't just point to the legislative branch and say, look, they need to do their job. The fact is he's on the same side of the aisle as the majority in the House, and he needs to do his job to get them to move forward on some of these things. So today, the bill that we're going to focus on shows that we have a path to dramatically reduce emergency powers. There could be some other directions. Our preference would be that we remove them totally, but if it just focuses on the things that receive the federal money specifically related to COVID, that would be a good thing. And so with that, first we'll have the representative introduce this. She's the one that basically came up with this idea, and we'll go from there and take questions after the 4 of us speak.
Good morning. It's good to be back in the Capitol and to see everybody's face. I'm Representative Barb Haley from Red Wing. Thank you, Senator. As Senator said, we've been working on this issue all session and really been trying to listen to the governor, the executive branch, and bring forth reasonable solutions. The governor himself has said in the past month that all he needs is the ability to procure and distribute vaccinations. We're very close in Minnesota to having 70% of folks vaccinated, so that's a very good sign. And then he's also said that we want to make sure that we don't put at any jeopardy the federal money that's been flowing to the state because of the federal emergency declaration. So we look to solve those 2 questions that the governor posed, and my bill does that. It's patterned after an Alaska bill that has been tested, so we're not out on a limb here with anything that hasn't been done across the country. And it provides the governor without emergency powers, the ability to continue to procure and distribute vaccines, and it puts us in a position to continue to receive the federal money. It ends the Chapter 12 emergency declaration that we're operating under right now. I counted up the days this morning. It's been nearly 500 days. I don't think anybody anticipated that the Chapter 12 clause in our Constitution would go beyond 30 days, much less 500. The emergency is over. We're going to provide the governor the things he needs to do to manage COVID, and we're going to restore the legislature as a co-equal branch of government. A very reasonable proposal, and we don't see any reason why we can't move forward with this and then get to the work of finalizing the budget. I'd like to turn it over to Senator Howe, who I've been partnering with on this bill, and who was in the meeting when this was introduced to the governor last week. Senator Howe.
I will tell you that we proposed this bill to the governor last Thursday. I was actually in Colorado Springs going to swear my nephew into the Air Force as a second lieutenant as he was graduating from the Air Force Academy. I actually stayed back from that graduation to meet with the governor. I will tell you, in my 38 years in the military, in my 27 years in the fire service, in my 9 years in the legislature, I've never been treated in such a condescending manner. Basically, anything we said was not worth his consideration. What I don't understand is, and if anybody knows me and has worked with me at the legislature, I have always worked to compromise. I have always worked across the aisle to try and find a way to make things work. If you don't like something in a bill of mine, offer an option, and we will work through it. We'll find a way to make it happen. But to just unilaterally say it doesn't work, I think is outrageous. So we all know that the emergency is over. There's no reason, like Senator Gazelka said, that we couldn't take the eviction moratorium off-ramp bill and the bill that's Representative Haley and I have put together and worked out a way to get through this. But I don't think he has any intentions of going there. I mean, why hasn't he offered any other options? Why isn't that out there? He needs to answer for that. I will say that, and I'm going to get this right here, because I want to paraphrase Thomas Jefferson. Governor Walz has continued with his emergency powers, relinquished from the citizens of Minnesota their right to representation, as he silenced the legislature. A right that Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, and I paraphrase, immeasurable to the people, their right to representation, but formidable to tyrants only. Now I'm going to end with asking each and every one of you that when you go out to eat, when you go to the Home Depot, when you go to the hardware store, thank those people that are working. Thank them for working. Because I know too many shops and cafes that have had to limit their hours or limit their days of being open because they can't find employees. I did that last night. I thanked a young lady at Home Depot for working. Her eyes lit up. It meant more to her than anything she had heard that day. So go out. We can make a difference. Go out there and thank those employees. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Minority Leader Dow.
Thank you, and thank you all for joining us this morning. Obviously, the governor's emergency powers is an issue that we've talked a lot about over the last 15 months in the House. I think we have voted 19 times to end them, with Democrats in the House rebuffing that effort every single time. The reality is the governor does not need the emergency powers. You see that in other states. Actually, there are governors right now giving up their emergency powers voluntarily. I want to thank Representative Haley and Senator Howe for the work that they've done on this bill. Because if it were me, I would say we're just ending the emergency powers, period. The governor does not need them. The federal money will continue for a month after we end it'll continue in the month after the month that we end the emergency powers. So right now we would have that money until the end of July. The reality is we don't need that money, and we should end them. The eviction moratorium is still in place. We don't need that in place. That needs to end. You know, we've got school kids wearing masks, and I wonder if this isn't the real reason that the governor right now is clasping onto his emergency powers with white knuckles, is that the grip over the teachers union, that the teachers union has over the governor and keeping masks in schools and keeping masks on teachers. I wonder if that's not the reason the governor is still holding on to these emergency powers. But I'm thankful for Representative Haley and Senator Howe for the work that they have done, because they have, in a real attempt to compromise, answered the things that the governor is concerned about and dealt with those in this bill. He said that he's concerned about his ability to supply vaccines, and this bill still gives him the ability to do that. He has said that he wants to make sure that we don't disrupt federal money coming to the state. This bill does that. So we have answered every one of his objections, and it's time to end the emergency powers. Now, I would love to say, in a spirit of compromise, that I would love for the governor to accept this bill. The reality is, I don't care what the governor thinks. The governor hasn't cared what the legislature has thought for 15 months, and he has not included the legislature. He's intentionally excluded the legislature from this response, and ultimately the governor in Chapter 12 does not have a role in ending the emergency powers. He can not renew them if he chooses to, but the legislature can take a vote and end his emergency powers. If it were up to me, I'd put this language into one of the budget bills and send it to his desk. He cannot veto policy language. He can only line item veto funding language, dollar amounts, and I would force the governor to sign this bill. Personally, I would end the emergency powers abruptly, but I thank the representative and senator who have gone through so much effort to really meet the governor's objections and answer them, and come up with a solution that frankly would end the emergency powers, but still give him some leeway to respond to COVID. The time for ending the emergency powers has passed. It passed a long time ago. The legislature has been in session for the last 5 months, and we were here with our sleeves rolled up and ready to work and ready to respond alongside the governor to respond to COVID in a responsible way. And the governor passed on that opportunity and intended to keep his emergency powers, and I believe he still intends to keep them as long as he can. I remember saying midway through the year last year that it wouldn't surprise me if the governor still had his emergency powers on December 31st. And people would say, oh, no, that's not, no way. And the governor, here we are in June. The governor still has emergency powers. And I'll be honest with you, I wouldn't be surprised if he still has them on December 31st. So I think we all can understand now the necessity for the emergency powers has passed, and it's time for them to end. So this is a great opportunity. This is a very reasonable opportunity to come to some level of compromise on ending those emergency powers. And I think we'll stand for some questions.
Any Democrats included on board, especially in the House?
No, this was introduced just recently and part of the negotiations, but at this point we had a lot of good discussion in the Legislative Process Reform Committee. We actually had a bill from Representative Sandsteed that was different than this, but at that time a process out of the emergency powers, but the Democrats themselves couldn't garner their votes to move it out of committee. So I don't think they've had the they may have individual interest, but I don't know that they've had leadership interest in moving this forward.
Could you cobble together enough of those individual interests for your caucus plus some of them pass it? Is that a route?
And we're having some of those discussions just offline now, and seeing where that can lead. I don't know if you have more to comment on it.
During the meeting, Speaker Hortman said, Governor, I think the speaker, she said, I think the senator's just trying to find common ground. And the governor shifted his focus from me to her and actually went after her for agreeing that we were trying to find common ground. Apparently, he didn't want to find any that day, so.
Yeah, we got to be careful what we say in those meetings. We're trying to find solutions, but there's a lot of frustration on our part with the emergency powers. What I did not mention, what makes it unique in Minnesota, is we're the only divided legislative branch in the entire country, and so on our side of the aisle, we're the short end of the stick. It's 2 against 1, but I do think, again, speaking to Democrat leaders around the country, that Democrat leaders around the country also think that emergency powers are being abused in their state, and so we think it's time. I totally agree with Representative Doubt that we want emergency powers to end, but we are trying to find a way to limit them dramatically if that's what we can agree with the House Democrats. And so it's been a very frustrating journey for all of us.
Senator Gazelka, according to the global agreement that you signed with Speaker Hortman and the governor, any policy agreements would need to be decided by June 4th, and all three of the principals would need to be in agreement on that. So by having the press conference today, is this one thing that just hasn't been hashed out privately in the past couple of weeks? And do you see this falling by the wayside as you've discussed other policy things that could happen too if no agreement is reached by June 4th?
Yeah, I want to be careful about some of the wording in the global agreement about what the House, the Senate, and the governor, particularly myself, the Speaker, and the governor agree to. Once the targets were set, all of the policy discussions have continued, and that is not continuing so much with myself and the Speaker in inviting the governor in. That is mostly the chairs trying to work through some of the difficulties. So that we're basically operating the way the Speaker and I envisioned it, even though the wording was not crystal clear to that.
Mr. Leader, I haven't seen the legislation, so help me get the scope of this. Is this to end the emergency powers here in this specific incident, or does this have legs to any governor, whoever serves after this?
No, this just deals with COVID-19. It does not do anything to Chapter 12 going forward. It is just dealing with ending COVID-19 emergency powers. If another event happens, another pandemic, another tornado or flood, he could declare emergency powers and deal with that. This just deals with COVID-19.
Yes.
If you want to respond to that first.
Yes, and I would just add that I think there's significant work that we should do on Chapter 12. We've talked about, rewriting Chapter 12. This has been an experience that none of us imagined. And I'd say whether you're Democrat or Republican and you like the governor or you don't, we should all recognize that we've been faced with a scenario we didn't anticipate. Chapter 12 needs to change. So that's work that we still need to do. But my bill does end the emergency powers today for COVID-19. And it allows the state to declare a public health disaster. And that's what we need in order to secure the federal money coming in, as long as the federal government has an emergency declaration. So that's the difference. But the governor will have no more emergency powers outside of being able to distribute and procure vaccines. And I'd ask him maybe to think back to the measles outbreak in 2018, maybe 2019 in Minneapolis. It was the first time in the state. It was the largest infectious disease outbreak that we had had in 50 some years. We didn't need emergency powers to deal with the measles outbreak. We have we have a Department of Health. They were able to procure vaccines and work with the public and get the information out, and we were able to manage through that measles outbreak. So we can do this without a Chapter 12 emergency.
Is this your bill that you introduced right at the end of session,
Yes.
or has it been changed at all?
Yes, we introduced it right at the end of session. You may have recalled when I stood on the House floor and I said to Majority Leader Winkler, I said, I have the language right here. We could pass it today and we could end this session without Chapter 12 emergency. And I walked over across the floor of the House and I handed him the language. There's just been two minor changes made, and that came out of feedback from the meeting that Senator Gazelka and Senator Howe had with the governor. Just two phrases. We added a phrase on vaccine distribution and a phrase that it would be in consultation with MDH as far as declaring this public health disaster. So those have been done again in response to the governor's feedback.
Senator Gazelka, could you comment broadly on how budget negotiations are going behind the scenes and on the layoff notices that went out over the weekend?
Yes, so it was really important that we had the target set. That's the framework to get done. If you go back the last two budget cycles, once the targets were set, we typically got done in about 5 days. But I think legislators across the board would say, hey, we wanted more input and more time. That's what they have right now. So we set the targets. We know the governor's got to call us back June 14th. If he wants emergency powers, we know he wants emergency powers. So we will be back, and we will stay back until we're done. We're not going to just be in for a day. We're going to make sure that we get it done. Notices went out to the state employees that if we don't finish by July 1, they're laid off. They have to have those notices 30 days ahead of time. The governor tried to blame the legislative branch and say if they don't get their work done, and I would simply say, look, you're on the same side of the aisle as the Democrats in the House. You are the one that have to work with them to help influence and us then come together to have a compromise. I do believe that we will get done before the shutdown would occur. We will do our part, the Senate GOP, and we're going to make sure that we follow the things that we need to do. But keep in mind the targets have been set. There's no tax increase. There's $1 billion of tax relief. Most of the federal money that's coming in is under the control of the legislative branch, which is what it's supposed to be. But we just have to go through to the end. And then what I'll say is, in different ways, chairs have been communicating with each other. We started working groups. They're working in different ways. And then once we get to June 14th, some of those bills could be wrapped up immediately, maybe all of them. It's just a matter of whether or not some of the things that are important get laid or get dumped overboard or not. Each side has some things that are really important to them. We're going to fight. Both sides are fighting for those things, but now we're into special session, so sooner or later you have to figure out how you're going to get done. The last thing I'll say is just reminding people that when the courts ruled in 2017 that they aren't responsible to fund state government if there is a shutdown, it is way different than it was under Dayton's shutdown. It's way different from that, in that many things don't get funded. And so if Walz leads us to a shutdown, well, that's on him. He's got to work with the House Democrats, and we'll work and figure it out.
Senator, where do you stand on police reform, voting rights, auto emissions, all of those other policy issues?
So there's a lot of policy issues that are still on the table. The police reforms, they're having good dialogue. I do think there will be some things that are adopted. The guideline that I set is it cannot be anti-police. So we're not going to do things related to, we're not going to put a citizen board over the police. I think the police know what they're doing. I think that's really important for them to be leading that across the state. We're not going to do qualified immunity, which means the individual police officer has to do their own liability, which is very expensive. So a number of things like that we won't do, but I do believe there'll be things in there that we can find that we agree on. And then as far as the 2-year moratorium on the California air and emission standards, that's our compromise. We think it's really important that we delay that. We don't want Los Angeles air standards. We don't want our local dealers to have 7% of their stock of cars electric when people only buy about 1%. We think it's coming. We think electric cars are coming. We think infrastructure should be thought about. But that is something that we're still trying to see if there's a solution there. And so there are some things like that. We think there should be election integrity, photo ID for voting. That's, I think, really important to us, but they have been very resistant to that. And so that's the part we have to see, but we also know we're in special session moving to July 1, which would be very difficult for all of Minnesota.
Have there been any more specific deals made on the relief for businesses for COVID and for riot damage? I know there's $150 million broadly, but how would a business qualify for that? Has there been any deal on that?
Yeah, so the question is, in the jobs bill, we've talked about $150 million for business relief. They're still working through that, whether it's grants or low interest loans. The governor, as you know, has a pot of money that he can also use for some of that. So we're still trying to work through that. I do believe that we are much closer than we were a week ago in that some of the things that the Democrats were demanding are now off the table.
Has there been any movement on the clean cars issue since you proposed delaying it for 2 years?
Is there any delay or any progress on the clean cars? That's the part I don't know. It's still on the table, something we're trying to work through.
Have each of the working groups met, and can you tell us how many spreadsheets are finished at this point?
Have all the working groups met? I believe all the working groups have met. Some of them are done, not all of them. Some of the bigger, more complicated ones were just hard to get on the same page. You can agree on the number, but how do you get on the same page? I think all of them are on the same page now, and so that's encouraging.
Senator, if the governor calls you in, is it June 14th when this would happen? Would you stay in special session even if there's not an agreement by then? Would you just stay in session as opposed to adjourning and making them call you back again? Or how would that work?
If I believe we're called in June 14th. It's my intention to stay until we finish. To adjourn and then have them call us back would not be, I think, the right way to do it. We're too close to the end where not getting it done matters. I mean, what happens to funding for jails, what happens to funding for nursing homes, for state parks, for all the permits that businesses need. There are just so many things that are impacted this time that I think it's really critical that we just stay there to get it done. But I will say, because we had the targets done at the end of session, there's a lot of work that can happen and I think has been happening that makes it more likely we'll get done. I mean, that's always the toughest number. We got that one.
Got time for one more, guys. Can we go back to the initial bill? If you became governor, would you be comfortable with these changes if you'd live with them?
If I was governor, we would do this bill, but if I was governor, we would get rid of emergency powers. I really believe that our governor has abused emergency powers. I talked to other states and they have much more limited use of the emergency powers. I just think it's, for 15 months, it's been an abuse of power. And so I hope we can find a way through it. I will say that no matter what, we need to improve and correct this for the future. This should never happen again. So, thank you.
One more, if we could. Should Minnesotans be concerned that we are this close to a possible shutdown and so many of these same issues exist?
Okay, last one. So she asked, should Minnesotans be concerned? They should be concerned, but I want them to know that I'm hopeful. We've been through a lot this last year with the riots and the COVID shutdowns and all the different things that have just really put people on edge. I want them to know that we're going to figure it out. We are going to figure out how to get there. It's never easy. We solved it 2 years ago with divided government. We will solve it again. So I want people to have hope. I think that's what people are asking for right now, hope. They want to live their lives. They want government to work for them, and that's my commitment, and I'll ask the same of the governor and the speaker.
One final. What's an example of how he's abused emergency powers? Can you just give us a couple of examples?
Well, think about eviction moratoriums, that you've given people free rent for 15 months, but there's been nothing for the landlord. Typically, an owner, it's a small business guy or small family that decides they want a 2-apartment thing that they can rent out, or a 4-apartment. They're still making their loan payment if they're able to do it anymore. So that's something that should have ended a long time ago. Think about the different decisions along the way. Bars could be open with 50 people. Churches could only have 10 people at the exact same time. I mean, some of the rules that we did, I just think were extreme. Now the data is coming out that mask mandates were no different in states that did not mandate it, but strongly suggested people wear it, than states like Minnesota that it was mandated. Think about kids in sports having to wear masks playing sports outdoors when we know that there was no risk for that youth to be of COVID. And so the fact that schools, the teachers still are wearing masks now and the students are still wearing masks now, there's zero science that makes any sense. Those are some abuses that we see. All right, thank you.